Welcome to Generation Digital Workforce, the podcast that's here to explore the role of robotic process automation and other digital technologies. Whether you're just getting started or you're looking for advanced strategies and tactics, if you're curious about where human and digital workers are coming together to transform the future of work, then this podcast is for you. All right, let's get into the show.
Hey, we're glad you joined us on Generation Digital Workforce. This is Michael Marchuk, and I'm joined today by Eric Maloney, Advisor Partner and Solutions Director for Blue Prism. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
So, Eric, you've recently published an article on RPA and blockchain. Can you walk us through some of the basics to start with so we're all on the same page? For example, starting us off with a very simple one, which is, what is blockchain and what can it be used for?
Well, thank you very much. So people may not have actually heard the term very often or in context, but they've really heard of instances of it with things like blockchain and other cryptocurrencies. The underlying platform and architecture that allows for this distributed management of a ledger of information is blockchain. So how would you show asset ownership and transactions? How would you track all of the what they're called smart contracts in place between parties without middlemen to manage assets and ownership? That happens inside of blockchain.
So we've heard a lot about blockchain specifically as it relates to Bitcoin. They're not the same thing.
That's correct. So in the case of a cyber currency, what you're doing is you're creating an agreement between parties in an open peer-to-peer network to exchange something of value, in this case, say, Bitcoin. And what's happening is the people who are members of that blockchain create entities, immutable entities, and there's an immutable log of all the transactions, when they buy, when they sell the blockchain, what assets they own at what time, who they transferred them to. So there's going to be really no question of ownership down to the moment of the transaction. And that ledger is logged in multiple instances that different members of the blockchain and federated partners of the blockchain maintain. So it's no one centralized source. It's a distributed set of journals and logs that are kept of the transactions in a blockchain. This way you can be assured that nobody's manipulating the system or hacking into the system and corrupting the entire set of transactions, because it can be rebuilt from any one of the disparate journals that are created in a peer-to-peer environment.
So I take it that really sets blockchain apart from other transactional tracking options.
Well, that's actually the crux of it. The reason it was invented was once you understand that you can have mutual trust among parties, you can vet out and remove third parties from carrying out those transactions, clearing houses, in different industries, different middlemen. So in the insurance organizations around the world, they have to do a lot of reconciliation between claims, counterclaims, joint disbursements. That requires a tremendous amount of overhead and a lag time in processing any type of insurance claim. If you had a blockchain in place, you could create these, as I mentioned earlier, a term smart contracts, where in advance all the parties agree that here are the assets, here are the scenarios in which these contracts are invoked, and once an agreement is reached, that contract's in effect. So once you say that we've recognized the claim, all the disbursements can start happening without having to be vetted through third parties. And so you can see transaction times where you traditionally would have multiple weeks to vet through all of the interested parties down to a matter of minutes.
What's the value of combining blockchain with RPA? Because I'm not sure I'm getting the connection between those two technologies.
So that's a good question, because the title of my blog was RPA, digital networks like blockchain and connected RPA have nothing to do with each other and everything to do with each other. And the reason I wrote it that way is you could, as I said before, carry out all these processes without blockchain. But once you do have a blockchain, you're inheriting a set of new processes that you have to have consensus about by all the federated members of the blockchain. All of the operations and administrations components of establishing and setting up a blockchain, adding members to the blockchain, distributing the ledgers and a reconciliation of the logs of a blockchain. These are things that require a lot of planning, and there is a cottage industry that's quickly growing of consultancies to set these services up. And therein lies a big challenge, because what if they favor one party over another? What if they make a mistake, yet it's not clearly spelt out in the agreements? What if they want to change technology standards and they've already built something for you? It gets quite complicated. What you can do with Connected RPA is you can create a digital workforce to carry out different discrete roles in the world of operating the blockchain, administering the blockchain, generating new nodes, generating new journals and logs of the blockchain with these completely impartial digital workers. And each party to the blockchain, say if you're working across the insurance industry, as I mentioned earlier, each one of them can deploy identical workflows on how to maintain their nodes of the blockchain, their components. So they're all very consistent, yet they're not sharing any IP across the corporate boundaries. They're not making themselves vulnerable to third-party consultants to maintain those relationships.
So we talked a lot about the blockchain itself. I've heard this term off-chain. What does that have to do with this?
So actually, that's a term that's emerged only in the last couple of years. Blockchain as a concept has been around for almost a decade. And when you think of setting up a blockchain, all the things I mentioned earlier, there's a certain cost and complexity to setting something up in a blockchain. There could be tremendous value, as I said earlier, time to value, reduction in processing time and all those positives. But there is an inherent cost to operating a blockchain and carrying out transactions on that platform. So what's happening is organizations are realizing it's their record of truth. That's where they initiate a smart contract. But because of that agreement that was executed in a blockchain, they're going to go to downstream systems of record, downstream solutions for generating collateral documentation, for processing an example of insurance claims. Those would be in off-chain services. And that's another opportunity to consider Connected RPA and intelligent automation, because now you can train digital workers to carry out all the tasks which were allowed to take place once that transaction was executed in a blockchain.
So as we're looking at the blockchain technology, generally speaking, do you think that 2020, this year, is this the year of the blockchain?
Well, people have been talking about the year of the blockchain for about a decade now. So that's always a great question. And I can't tell you which will be the year of the blockchain. The reason it's a good question is it's a point where it's now an accepted platform for consideration and design. Most of the financials and insurance clients that I've come in contact with, directly and indirectly through partners, are all in advanced pilots of blockchain. Some very novel, some around use cases that could not easily be fulfilled without a blockchain, some novel solutions that, because you can work so quickly on a blockchain, you can do some integration with marketing AI and ML services that otherwise you couldn't actually leverage in fulfilling services for your clients or partners. So I think it's not so much that it's ever going to be the year of blockchain, but you've just seen this progressive exploration and initial adoption of the platform that it's not going to go away.
So as you're looking at these organizations that are taking on these blockchain pilots and whatnot, what's hindering their adoption rate? Because if it's been blockchain's around for 10 years or so, what's hindering them from going full bore into this?
Well, again, there's an interesting question you have to ask. Are you going to create a consortium to found a blockchain, or are you going to go through the due diligence to join a blockchain? So if you're looking at a new set of middleware services in clearing, in finance and accounting, the high ground is to those who create their blockchain first. So are you going to want to join somebody else's or found your own? And if you found your own, how are you going to get others to join? So there's kind of been this circular logic. I think what's happened over the last few years is fewer grandiose ideas have been promoted. Rather than have these massive consortiums doing whole middleware functions, you're starting to see point solutions leveraging blockchain. There's a small example of an insurance company, and what they're doing is they're marrying a solution that is using AI to determine through social media if one of their life insurance policyholders has passed away. And if so, then they go back to local records to validate what they found on social media. And once they've validated that, they go through the contracts that they have in place for that insured to find beneficiaries and contact them. And they're doing this because they realize it's something of a reputational loss. They have many people who have their policies that their survivors, their beneficiaries, aren't even aware of these policies. And if they're not fulfilled in a period of time, the payments don't stay with the company, they revert to the ownership of the state. So no individual really benefits from not fulfilling the insurance policy, but there's reputational loss and trust issues with the insurance company by not following through. With blockchain, they're able to avoid fraud by allowing only one-time generation of beneficiary notices through the smart contracts of the blockchain to the beneficiaries. So people won't make false claims or redundant claims. And there's very little confusion about the system of record being generated in this scenario. And it was an interesting pilot. It was conducted in 2018 to 2019. It's really something that they're going to build on and think of deploying globally beyond where they are now in Northeast Asia.
So you mentioned this whole concept of a consortium running a blockchain. Can you describe that a little bit more? Because I know we've talked about the general concept of what a blockchain is, but when you mentioned that consortium thing, perhaps you could define that a little bit more.
So thank you. It's not really a consortium running a blockchain, it's a consortium joining a blockchain. So somebody would set up the original definitions of the transactions that can take place in the blockchain. They set up the definitions of what it would be to be a member and a reconciliation. In some scenarios, that term of smart contract, really it's very much that the contract is the basis of the transaction in the blockchain. So there's actual legal verbiage that says if you carry out this transaction, here are the SLAs, here are the liabilities and such. So there's a lot of work into creating that. The consortium concept is if you're fulfilling a common industry function. I mentioned earlier, say, like middle office clearing, reconciliation of payments. You need to have a broad consensus to join and adopt those standards. That is not trivial. When you have impartial third parties try to do it, they don't necessarily have these backing and the gravity of key industry players. When key industry players have explored it, well, then it gets difficult because the smaller players and competitors don't necessarily feel great interest to join because they don't want to throw themselves at a disadvantage. So to get that level of understanding, as I said before, there may not actually be, in the case of cyber currency, one leader. Matter of fact, there are dozens and dozens of cyber currencies and more every year. And some of them pass away and some of them get some traction. But when you get to really the enterprise uses for blockchain, what I'm seeing is these point solutions I alluded to earlier, the example I gave of the insurance company. So you're going to need not so many consortiums, but just your downstream vendor ecosystem willing to operate through a blockchain to reduce the overhead costs of transactions.
So you alluded to this before, you just mentioned it regarding the costs of the transactions. So I understand that there's going to be servers and infrastructure and networks and people running these operations, but is there a cost itself to putting a transaction onto the blockchain or reading a blockchain transaction?
Well, in a very simple sense, yes, there is, and that's actually a business case for every cloud provider. All the major cloud providers have a blockchain offering. And the reason is it requires infrastructure consumption to run a transaction. There has to be networking to the blockchain service. There has to be some cycles of the CPU, and there's going to be some storage and archiving of all the information, especially a high transaction blockchain that's creating journaling. So you're going to see Amazon, Google, Microsoft, IBM all working in this place. And it's an area that they are trying to build more and more awareness of their offerings. So bottom line, yes, there's a fundamental cost to operating a blockchain. Otherwise, these cloud providers would not be interested in offering these services.
So where do we go from here on this whole blockchain connected RPA journey?
So as I said before, when you employ connected RPA, when you really start understanding the automation of the external operations and administration of a blockchain, you can build some trust. Your time to deployment, time to value for the members is a lot more predictable and acceptable. And within the transactions of the blockchain and the off-chain task orchestration and execution, connected RPA is a very strong fit. And it also is a third thing. Blockchain has had a historic challenge, especially in financial services and insurance, of performance. I forgot to mention earlier, that's one of the drivers of off-chain. You don't want to have everything going through a highly centralized choke point of a blockchain to reconcile all the transactions that take place after a transaction is executed. You would have those operations distributed, and having connected RPA to keep track of all those different dependencies and contingencies and having them take place. And one last interesting thing about the way Blue Prism handles connected RPA is there are exceptions built into the process. Exceptions are a good thing in the Blue Prism platform. So you could not question the smart contract or the transaction that took place in the blockchain. You could do a due diligence and carry out the prescribed tasks from that transaction in the blockchain. But if you run into an issue, an unavailability of a downstream service or some other criteria that's been modified or changed, or something dynamic, where there's a new member of the blockchain that needs to be notified, you can create exceptions at the digital worker level to accommodate that. So you'll require fewer changes and updates to the smart contracts within the blockchain.
So Eric, why isn't everybody using blockchain to manage these smart contracts and manage all of their transactions this way?
Well, one of my favorite terms I use in connected RPA, but let's apply it to blockchain. Don't confuse simple with easy. It may sound simple to have a centralized ledger that everyone can turn to and have a definitive agreement carried out and a transaction executed, but that's not easy. The planning of it, as I said before, getting the consensus and the simple trust in it, operationalizing it and administration of it, and then carrying out downstream functions. Most blockchain initiatives over the last several years have failed because, one, the reality of the complexity of getting out into a pilot mode or proof of concept mode into some sort of live blockchain, those issues come front and center. And it overwhelms these small, agile teams that are exploring blockchain. So it's not a technical failing of blockchain. It is an operational and a planning limitation of the organizations that want to adopt it. And there's a good opportunity to engage connected RPA as part of the solution. It can help mitigate some of the complexities of operations, help mitigate the downstream transactions that we talked about before with off-chain activities. So that's kind of where the natural fit is. When you're at a point where a customer is thinking beyond the vision and ideation and the proof of concept of a blockchain, and really at the point of how are we going to deploy and scale a blockchain, that's the best time to introduce and discuss the opportunity of marrying that technology with connected RPA.
Well, I know with our RPA solution and blockchain, you can do some very powerful things, but to your point, it sounds like this requires some forethought because you're really doing things differently.
Yes, definitely forethought in how you would operationalize it. As I said before, the real business purpose behind a blockchain, that vision, that ideation, that proof of concept that would be built to solidify the value to the company that wants to sponsor it or join a blockchain, that doesn't require so much the connected RPA understanding or enlistment at that point per se. But the moment you want to build the business cases, how is this going to scale? How is this going to be financially affordable? Right? As you have more transactions, how do you keep the costs constant or minimal? That's the best time to really think of automation.
Well, thank you, Eric. I appreciate you joining us today on Generation Digital Workforce. If you are interested in finding out more on this topic, please take a look at Eric's blockchain article that can be found on blueprism.com. You can find a direct link to this article in the show notes. Until next time, thank you for joining us on Generation Digital Workforce.
You've been listening to Generation Digital Workforce. If you want to hear more about RPA, AI, and other cognitive technologies that are shaping the future of work, join us next time as we continue to go deeper on these topics with industry innovators and experts. To make sure you never miss a future episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. And if you've liked what you heard today, please leave us a review. It's one of the best ways to help more people find valuable content. For show notes and more info, visit us at blueprism.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.